People logging in right now are just wondering if their sound works. It does. We'll be on in just 1 minute. All right, my clock just moved over, Bart. Mike, are you guys ready?
Yep.
Ready.
Awesome. All right. Well then, hello and welcome to Data Chats, a series of webinars and podcasts from Pragmatic Institute that help tackle the biggest challenges facing today's data teams and data-driven organizations. My name is Rebecca Calageris. I am the Vice President of Marketing and Product Strategy at Pragmatic Institute, and more importantly for you, the host of today's event. This has been a really exciting couple of months at Pragmatic Institute as we relaunched our data practice, which helps organizations leverage data to drive business success. Our courses and our resources like this are really designed to provide individuals and teams with actionable guidance, hands-on practice, a business-oriented approach so that they can solve problems and propel decision-making data. And we couldn't do any of that without the help of our data advisory board, which features industry leaders and experts from a wide variety of organizations, and whose efforts help to ensure that alumni after the courses can really have that strategic impact within their organizations. And I bring up the board because we are very excited to have with us two different board members. We've got Barton Poulson, founder of datalab.cc, instructor and lover of all things data related. He has over 25 years experience working with businesses, nonprofits, and students on their work with data. We also have Mike Lukianoff, a data science entrepreneur and advisor and the founder of analytics firm Czarmetrics. Bart and Mike are here today to provide actionable insights and best practices for applying data analysis and business strategy. Now, before we dive into today's presentation and I turn over the mic, a couple of housekeeping items real quick. First, we will send out an email with a link to the recording of this webinar and the slides, and as well as a couple other goodies that you'll get in the next couple of days. So if you miss a section, if you want to just listen to Bart and Mike like an ongoing basis, all of that will be available to you. And second, questions. We love questions, right? We've got two ways to ask them. For questions for the guests or myself, please use the Q&A box, and we'll be tackling questions that we receive throughout the day at the end of the presentation. And then we've also got a chat box, which several of you have found, for conversations and exchanges with your peers. All right, with our housekeeping items done, with Bart and Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wonderful.
When I think back on when I started my career in data and analytics, I spent a lot of time convincing business leaders that they needed data to make better decisions. And that's just not the case anymore. Most business leaders understand that better data and better analytics is going to lead to a better decision. And then there was a time when just finding the quality staff to be able to handle the data and be able to create a good analysis, that was very difficult to find too. And now I think that we've got some really very high quality data science and analytical teams out there. We've got executives who understand that they need the data, but now there's this really big problem of this chasm between these two different groups that don't really speak the same language. And even though they've got the capabilities to be able to execute high quality analytics and business solutions, they're not speaking the same language, and they can't seem to get across this divide. One of the problems is that if the business stakeholders don't really understand what the data is required that can answer the questions, the actual business questions that they're trying to answer, and a lot of the data teams don't really understand fully what the business metrics are and the business questions are. And there's not really a translator between the groups who can help to bridge this divide and try and make the questions tangible and try and make sure that the data can actually be turned into relevant business questions. And that's really why why you end up with some of these staggering statistics about the success rate of data science projects. Gartner reports that about 80% of data science projects fail. And a lot of this is because when you start the data science project, many of the projects are not even being defined right at the outset. They may be too far-reaching. They may be too broad, too ambiguous. It may be, but a lot of it just starts at how it's being defined right out of the gates. It's either too ambitious or not specific enough, and a lot of this has to do with this giant gap between the two different stakeholders within the businesses. So what this problem led to, as we were trying to figure out, was really this pragmatic data analysis model, which really is what we were trying to get to was how do we come up with a process, not for analysis necessarily, but for defining the entire problem of molding a process for businesses to define a problem and communicate it through the organization to solve for big data science problems that are actually going to be tangible and add value within the business. So if we start with the first step, which is really defining the business problem, and this, I found one of the big problems with a lot of, and it's not just with data teams, a lot of businesses, I think, it's like, let's hit the ground running, let's, dive in and get to it, right? It's a lot of, business cultures are about, just get going, right? And oftentimes you sort of skip this really important step, which is, let's really get our plan together. Let's really understand and define what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And in data, it's absolutely critical to really decompose what it is that the business is trying to understand about itself and what the goals are that it's trying to lay out, and then bring it back into the actual data. And I've seen time and time again that businesses are skipping this step of defining what is the business problem, what are the hypotheses that we're either trying to prove or disprove in this initial step, and they're skipping over it and they're diving right into the analysis instead of really trying to define what it is and how that is going to affect the business goals, and getting buy-in from all of the business stakeholders. Because if you're not getting buy-in from the business stakeholders, then it really doesn't matter what you're analyzing or what you're going to come out with. You're not setting the right parameters. You're not setting the right expectations with the people who are going to have to do something with the results of whatever analysis you're about to embark on. The second step is really preparing for that. So once you've defined it, then you've got to really dive in. And anybody who's done any extensive data analysis knows that once you start really getting into the data, things start to change. You start finding, oh, I'm missing this piece, or these databases don't connect, or I need to supplement with this external piece of data, or there's 110 million different things that could go wrong once you get into the data itself. That is either going to change the cost of it, it's going to change the time of it, it's going to change what the potential outputs of it are. So once you get into preparing this, which means some part of the analysis, it doesn't mean that you're completing the analysis, but you're getting into some real data diligence to really start framing what all of these pieces are going to be, so that you can rethink what's actually possible and feasible with the data itself. Once you've done that, then you need to rethink how you define the business problem and all the hypotheses, And you need to prepare to go back and refine that with the stakeholders. So the next step is to prepare to go back to the stakeholders and refine those statements. This takes some courage, right? And this is something that data people, right? Data scientists, analysts, this group is not being taught how to do this at all. You need to actually go back to these people, and the organization needs to be prepared for this, to be able to come back to the executive team, to the sponsor of this project and say, you asked for this, and we can't deliver this with this data in this time frame with these parameters. With the data that we have, if you want that, these are the things that need to be added to it, or we can deliver this or that with these changes in parameters. This is extremely important, and this is a step that gets changed that doesn't happen in most organizations. And this is why you get things called scope creep, or a failed data project, because it goes from a 3-month project to a 6-month project to a 9-month project to a 12-month project that then delivers something that you didn't want and didn't care about, because you never went back and refined it after you went deep into the data to really understand what's possible, feasible, and go back to the stakeholders to refine and adjust what the parameters of the project are. This is incredibly important, right? And making sure that you're setting yourself up for success right out of the gates before you even get in and start analyzing the data. And most organizations are going to skip this step and hit the ground running, dive right in, start analyzing the data. Barton?
Yeah, to follow up on that, I'm reminded about the 80% of data science projects that fail. It makes me think of Sturgeon's law, which actually comes from literature, which says 90% of everything is crap. And so we're trying to avoid that part of the problem. Also, when it comes down to being precise about what you're trying to do, I mean, you can think about the difference between predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. Predictive analytics, which is so common in data science, is we're going to build a model that can predict what people will do in the future, or that can predict what a human would do in the same situation. It's an extremely important task. It gets an enormous amount of attention. But most of the time, when a person comes to you with a business problem, they're not asking for just a prediction. They want to say, tell me what to do. And that's a fundamentally different question that requires a different kind of data and a different kind of analysis. And this leads into the analyze phase. So analyze, most of the time people get a problem, they want to start jumping immediately to the models. I'm going to build a neural network to do this. I'm going to build some machine learning algorithm to do that. Those are very good for predictive models, for correlational models. But when you're trying to come up with a business strategy and you're going to try to tell people this is what you do as a result, you're going to need to simplify it to something that can be easily interpreted and that can be put into action. Really, two themes that come up constantly as we've prepared this course for Pragmatic, and as this model got developed, was the idea that we are looking for actionable insights, meaning your analysis needs to tell you what to do next. And we're also looking for a good return on investment, that we have to show that this is going to be the best way to reach our particular outcome. So in terms of analysis, it actually often involves keeping it a lot simpler. I have worked on projects where the best insights that we got from our data, one was from a spreadsheet join. It was an organization that has simply never joined the data tables for their clients with the data table from their donors. And once we joined those two, we were able to help them identify donors with high potential. They were a nonprofit, so that was really important. Another one, it was just a pivot table where we said, this is where you're getting your donors. And they had never done that. And so these simple methods can sometimes be the best. So analyze means choosing a method that is going to be most likely to give you these interpretable, actionable insights. And it's not necessarily the standard list usual suspects in data science. The fifth step in this model is present. And this is where you have to focus on actually telling the stakeholders what your actionable insights are. Now, I know that most analysts are not comfortable with that. They like to say, hey, look, I found something interesting, or here's an association here. But the whole point of conducting the project in the first place was to find out what to do next. And a lot of analysts are uncomfortable with that. They need to be able to say, this is the business solution. You had a business problem, not a data problem, a business problem, and that we are using data to help provide a business solution. It says, for instance, focus on this particular market, promote this item more, drop this location. Any one of those would be important for presenting as clearly as possible the business problem, the data that was used to answer it, and the business solution that can be justified by the data. Oops.
All right, so we talked about the 5 phases. So first we talked about the problems, right? Why we're all here. What are the problems that we have as data analysts and data people with our stakeholders, and some of those breakdowns. We talked about the 5 stages of the process, which we'll dig in a little bit more in concrete too. But I think one of the nice things, how do we talk about this less theoretical and more like give people an illustration? And I think, Mike, you've got a great story about where this maybe didn't go so right.
Yeah, I think, a real tangible example just in my career as, in data and data science, quite a few years back, my analytics company was purchased by an email marketing company that was trying to build a marketing automation engine. And they selected their first, call it guinea pig, to start building things out, because they wanted to make it tangible. They wanted to use it with a real client. And the client was a large chain restaurant that had a very large user database. And they were doing a lot of TV and traditional media. And they were very adept at traditional research. But we were trying to build, and this was already well in on course, or well in progress when my company was purchased, and then I came into the project while it was in progress. They had about 2 million people in their database, and they were trying to create this marketing engine that was based on one-to-one marketing. Now, the chief marketing officer at the client location was very adept at traditional marketing, and he wanted to take psychographic segments from their traditional media, and he wanted to use that as the basis for their one-to-one marketing in the database. So the data team at the time, or the data and the analysis and the product team, really just took that very much verbatim, and they said, okay, well, we'll do that. And instead of defining the project as, we're building a one-to-one marketing tool and we're going to dig into how that's going to be, the project took a life of its own as being, okay, we're going to take psychographic data and match it to a 2 million person database, and that became this really the driving force of this project. That if you've ever worked with psychographic data, and you understand that psychographic data is really trying to understand how people feel about things based on what magazine subscriptions they've used, and what some of their past purchases. And it uses clustering analysis, right? So if clustering analysis, which many of the people on this are going to understand very well, you're sort of, in some ways averaging out, based on 25 different types of characteristics. Works very well for traditional media, where you're trying to pluck out some of these attributes that you want to build a marketing campaign around that's going to go out into mass media, right? And then marketers love it because you end up having these segments called like, wealthy dads driving Porsches and, grandmas with shotguns and pickup trucks, right? That are very descriptive. But when you get down into the line items of who these people are, it's based on 25 different demographic and other characteristics and buying patterns and so forth. And when you get into like the wealthy dads, okay, well, all right, yeah, sure. 6% of them are actually women. And 18% of them don't have kids, and X% of them are below average income. So it starts to fall apart on the one-to-one. So when you start to try and take these segments and push it down into a database that's supposed to be very personalized one-to-one marketing, the whole thing starts to fall apart, right? Because this needs to be a personalized message. The other thing is, when you do that, each of these segments is completely proprietary. So it's incredibly expensive, right? So, it's the wrong approach. It's also an incredibly expensive approach. And the data that they actually did have in the database was incredibly rich because it had all of these buying patterns of how they actually used the restaurants, and what their birthday was, who they came with, right? All sorts of questions that they'd asked them in the past. And that was sort of being ignored because they sort of trusted the expertise of somebody who framed the business question for them, rather than stopping and going through a process like the pragmatic process and saying, let's dig into the whole purpose of this analysis of what we're trying to understand about the business, and stepping through it and refining it, right? And staying on budget. If they had actually gone through that, which actually, after it was extremely painful, we actually did go back through this and redefined it, right, by using the right data sets and so forth, and did end up building, I think, a product that people were proud of. But we didn't have to go through the pain that we went through in the first round, and we wouldn't have if we had gone through a process like the one that we're talking about today.
And that's a great example, and I think a great illustration of why this course was developed and why we built the model, right? We have so many good questions coming in. This is going to be a really fun conversation, but one that came in that I think will be really good to start with, right? And if we take the analysis, pragmatic data analysis model, right? It's not the only sort of data analysis model out there. We talk about what makes this one unique and maybe more actionable. So, what will adopting this do for our listeners, and how can we help them have an impact?
I can answer that one. I saw that there was one question about, for instance, how does this framework differ from CRISP DM, the cross-industry standard process for data mining? And I have a personally embarrassing answer to that one. And that is, I have known about CRISP DM for, 5-10 years. I still don't understand what the steps are and how they relate to each other. I find it personally very confusing to me. But that may be more a me problem than a CRISP DM problem. What I like about this one is I can actually remember what's in it, and it lets me know, it's easy to define, prepare, refine, analyze, present. That's easy. I think the single biggest, or rather the quote unquote value proposition of this model is the third step, is the refine stage, which I know is included, at least implicitly, in so many other things. But this one really, because the refine here it's the reality check part. It's the let's not spend valuable time and resources going down a dead end trail. Let's make sure that we're going to be able to get something useful out of it. And while I'm familiar, a little bit with CRISP DM and other models for data projects, I find that emphasis on the reality check to be the single greatest contribution of this model.
Mike, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of models that are very zeroed in on how to analyze, and how to manage, a software project and that kind of thing. This is really much more geared toward how do you, as an organization, handle the communication, right, and defining and presenting, and how do you change your process to, again, bridge that divide, right? Which is, I think, a very different way of thinking about the problem. There are lots of models, that are going to help you to figure out how to better streamline and analyze the data itself. This is not going to help you analyze the data. This is assuming that you are good at your profession at analyzing the data, creating good models, and so forth, right? This is about how do you make sure that what you're doing when you analyze is actually relevant in what it produces, because there are tons of brilliant things being produced by brilliant data scientists and analysts that go nowhere, that are completely wasted because they weren't communicated at the end, right? They weren't presented in a way that anybody on the executive team or anybody in management can actually do anything with. Or they weren't defined properly at the outset, so they didn't actually solve the business problem. They solved some other problem that was really interesting, right, but didn't actually move the business forward, right? And that's what this is trying to do. It's trying to be a solution for the business, not just trying to create an efficient way of analyzing data.
And one of the things I think is great about the audience we have is we have people clearly on both sides of the project, right? We've got data professionals on the call, and we've got some of the stakeholders and the people asking data. So we're getting some really interesting questions from both sides. And I think it's an area that we spend a lot of time sort of exploring. How do these two groups work together? So we have some specific questions, but if you were going to start with just sort of like the top tips that you would give data analysts who want to immediately strengthen those partnerships, we go, and then maybe we can look at it vice versa as well.
I would say two things that would be particularly important are when a person comes in and invites you to work on a data project. First off, is what constitutes a good answer to this question? And very closely related to that is, what are you going to do with the answer? Where are you going to take this? What's going to change as a result of it? Because once you know what's going to happen with the answer, that makes a big difference. The sad thing is, I've been in lots of situations where, the stakeholder comes with say, we need to do this very involved data process as part of our, continual improvement. And what that really means is we're gathering data for gathering data's sake, and it may or may not go anywhere. I've been involved in too many of these. It's enormously frustrating because I know that, for instance, I try to tell people only gather data. I mean, you use up goodwill when you're gathering data from people. Only use it if you're going to do something meaningful that helps them with the same data. I don't like going to the doctor and filling out the same questionnaire 5 times. But I'm willing to do it if I know that each step is going to do something productive for me. But knowing how this is going to be used can help answer, when do we know that we have something that's going to be useful? And that gets you at least headed down the right path from the beginning.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing that I would recommend is understand the business that you're in and the metrics that are important to the people in the business. And that to a lot of people just sounds like, well, of course, but, I know too many people who just think, oh, that's the domain specialist who is, an afterthought on a lot of data science teams. Oh, that's the domain guy, right? So no, everybody needs to be the domain guy or the domain girl, right? Everybody needs to really understand the business, because if you don't understand, what the things are that are, the leading indicators and the lagging indicators, and, what's the stimulus and what's the result, and what's the, And if you can't deconstruct the business question into what those metrics are that can be followed, right? And oftentimes, there are business stakeholders who have been following certain metrics in the business who might not even know, what the root of why they've been following those business questions. Some of the biggest value add that some of the data science folks and analysts that I've worked with have done is question some of the metrics, right? When they start learning the business and they say, hey, I know that this is the metric that we're following, but maybe we should be following a different metric. I mean, that's probably everybody on this call has read the book Moneyball. That's what the whole book is about. You're chasing the wrong metric, right? That's not how you win. You win by putting people on the base, not by finding the slugger who's going to hit it out of the park, right? It may not be, the deep learning algorithm that's going to make you help them win the game. It may be that you ended up, figuring out that, hey, we need to actually find a different metric, or we need to trace a different metric, because all the questions that you're asking me can be answered with a metric that is available, but it's not in the BI report.
I keep reading all these amazing questions coming in, and it's it's fun and distracting. All right, so we're just going to start breaking down some of these, if that's all right. I think one of these is there's a lot that we talk about in define and refine, right? Really understanding the question that we're trying to solve. And I think one of the questions was, who owns that stage? And does an analyst have the ability to push back and say, hey, that's not a good question?
Any analyst who is worth employing should be able to push back. Otherwise, they're a tech, they're a functionary. And you've got people with very good minds. You should be taking advantage of that. You have an enormous resource available to you. And getting that buy-in from each other will always make the end result more productive. Now, it may be that you work for a very large organization with a very dense hierarchy. So maybe they're only going to go up, one step, maybe two steps. But there still needs to be some sort of coherence between the final goal of this and what the analyst is able to do. I really sincerely believe that shared negotiated reality on what the project is critical to a success.
Yeah, the define and refine stage isn't in there, for you to become a rebel without a cause, right? It's for you to be, honest, and it needs to be implemented in the organization and understood as part of a process that both sides of the chasm are embracing, right? This needs to be part of the culture, right? We're going to define this problem together. As the data person, it's my responsibility to quantify your problem and bring it back to you, right? And say, this is how I understand your question, right? In mathematical, right, and analytical terms. Did I understand you correctly? No, you're not getting it. Let's, look, if it's a breakdown that quickly and that easily, let's find out now, right? Not in 6 weeks, not in 6 months. They should be, this should be absolutely positively, accepted. And then if you get into the data, it should be absolutely part of the process and encouraged to say, hey, we have to change course. You're not saying it because you don't want to do it. It's you just want to bleed the organization with sort of trickling timeline extensions and until they get the bad news the hard way that it can't be done. Everybody should want this.
Yeah, and I think setting up the structure in the beginning allows you to push back there, right? I think what other people, not me, can do with models and data analysis is amazing. And it can feel like, and everybody hates this word, it feels a little bit like magic, right? So you're like, I don't know, we'll ask the data guys and they'll come up with an answer soon. And so you have to have a really healthy dialogue so you can focus on what is possible and where that biggest impact is going to be. And you did mention, both of you made the point that it's a dual effort, right? This is about changing the way analysts approach problems in their organizations, but it's also about how do we teach the organization how to better partner with the analysts. And so there's a couple of questions about like, how would you socialize this internally? Or are there resources they could send non-data people to understand why this is important?
I think the failure rate, I want to say, ask a stupid question, get a stupid answer. It's a variation on the garbage in, garbage out problem. If the garbage in is a vague, imprecise, poorly defined question that we just don't know that it's going to go somewhere, the garbage out is going to be an unusable answer. And I think that when people realize that if you ask a well-defined question, you're going to get a usable answer much, much faster. I think that kind of efficiency within an organization gets noticed. And I think it promotes itself.
Yeah, I also think that, people will look at a process like this and think, oh, well, we just added 3 months to the process. It's not true, right? I see people who can do this, in the course of a couple of hours, right? There's big questions and there's small questions, right? You can sit down with somebody and in the same conversation, go back and forth and say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is this, right? Now let me look back, or maybe I know what's in the data set, right? And I can actually say, we can't actually do an ROI model because we don't know what the cost of, this and that is, right? So the definition of ROI is not what you're looking for. What you're actually looking for is, a sales lift model, right? So let's be precise with our language about what it is that you're trying to do, right? Once you practice this, the efficiency with which you can execute it on either side, right, in the business or in the data, becomes highly efficient, right? It's not about slowing down a process.
No, excellent point. And as we talk about getting good questions and knowing like there are some good questions about like what is a good question? Do you have an example of here are some good hypotheses or questions that we tackled, or how you might structure a good question?
It actually goes down to, when people are asking sort of optimization questions, if they want to say, what's the best way for us to get new leads? That suggests that the outcome is the number of leads. And you can build a model that says, if we do this and this and this, we will get more leads. That's very different from saying, are they good leads, or are they leads that produce sales, or what is the value of the sale, or what is the long-term contract? So getting a lead in and of itself is not very handy. I mean, you can trick people into giving you their data, and boom, you have a lead, but you're not advancing the causes of the business. And in fact, like I say, goodwill is a limited resource. You burn up goodwill, you actually are working against the full goal of the business. Unless your business exists to generate leads and nothing else. And again, maybe you do that as a service for others. Leads are there to produce revenue for the business. Leads are there to produce the long-term viability of the business. And so you need to have that as part of the question. You can say, yeah, we're going to build a model to produce leads, but we have to remember it's part of this chain from here to here to here to here to here, because we don't want to maximize this at the expense of compromising these later steps. Again, getting leads that are empty or bad leads is just introducing noise into the system.
Excellent. All right. So as you would expect from, half the room full of data people, there are some questions about tools, right? And what kind of tools would you think work well with this model? Where are there, opportunities for different technologies within this? And so I'd love for you guys to reflect about what the thought process was with this model and approach as relates to the different tools that are available.
It works with any tool. I mean, literally, I gave you an example where we solved a business problem by doing a pivot table in Google Sheets. That's how they gave us the data, and it took like 20 minutes. Boom, there it is. I saw there's a comment about have we ever used AI or ML, machine learning? And I'll actually tell you, no, I don't touch those. Artificial intelligence or deep learning neural networks are really, really helpful if what you're trying to do is build an automated system to categorize photos or score mortgage applications or identify potential of fraud. It's really, really good for those things. But those are usually processes that are handled completely and implemented by the algorithm. There's not people sitting around at Amazon reviewing the algorithm's recommendations for you might also like. It just sticks them up there itself. And in those cases, machine learning algorithms are going to be very handy, but that's also because basically humans aren't involved. In strategic decision making in a business where it is a human who's going to be making the decision, I personally find those approaches to be counterproductive because they're really hard to interpret. My preferred method really is linear regression, because regression is really easy to understand. In fact, if you consider a decision tree machine learning, I'm talking a single decision tree, not a random forest. Decision trees are even easier to interpret. They're graphic. You can line it out. You can say, this is what we have going on with our data. Those are fabulous. I mean, otherwise, I really do think that keeping the analysis as simple as possible, because it has to be interpretable. And it has to be something that the people who've commissioned it, the stakeholders, can generalize and apply to new situations. And so while machine learning is very, very useful for very complex problems, again, translating speech to text or translated between languages, that's great. But for most business problems where a human's involved, a simpler method, a pivot table, a crosstab, a linear regression, a decision tree, those are going to be where you have your best analytical return on investment.
So I have a slightly different take on that. And look, I completely agree with Barton on, there's always trade-offs between accuracy and explainability, right? When you're choosing your methodology. But the company that I ended up selling, was all based on using machine learning methods for price optimization, right? Extremely difficult to explain to anybody, what's under the hood, but extremely efficient and extremely accurate. And if I had used anything other than that, I wouldn't have gotten the precise results that I was getting, and it wouldn't have been as useful, and scalable. But I also had a very unsophisticated customer who demanded to understand, what was going on, right? So that meant additional layers of other methodologies that I had to build in and around it, right, to make sure that I had some explainability layers, right? I think, which means that was incumbent upon me to make sure that, for every analysis that I was doing, I had to supplement, some of these really robust analyses with some other very simplistic types of explainable analyses to make sure that, the models were explainable, but also the business results were explainable, because ultimately that's really what they wanted to understand, right? They cared more about what the call it, the forecasting error, right? Or the accuracy of the output was at the end, right? They didn't really want to understand necessarily what all of the inner workings of the models were. They also wanted to make sure that they understood what the biases were. That was extremely important to them, right? And bias, man, you better understand that in some of these things today when you're working in a business, because if the executives think that you're reinforcing a bias against marginalized groups or what have you, right, You say, look, hey, there's no data, there's no bias in my data. That doesn't mean there's no bias in the world that's not going to be reinforced by, an opaque model, right? And that scares the crap out of people, right? If you try to bring that into, a Fortune 100 company, right, that's going to make a decision on marketing and pricing or whatever else, then wow, call the lawyers. So you better make sure that these are some of the things that you're testing and that you can explain, right? If you're going to use a difficult to explain model, right? So this is how deeply you need to make sure that you understand what you're doing, even when you're using models that that can't be explained, because you have to be able to employ those, but you also have to be able to employ the strategies and the analyses around those. And all of that, right, is part of defining the project, right? What's important to you in this, right, Mr. CEO, CFO, HR, whatever the position is, right? Ethics and compliance officer, right? What are my, what are my, what are my third rails, right? What's going to get us fried? You better understand all of these things, because these are the things that are our reality today in business.
Yeah, and I mean, I think both of you make really valid points, right? Like, I think that a lot of problems and analysis can be done with more simple tools, and that sometimes we overcomplicate things just because we as an exec, you hear a new tool, you think that's the best way. But I think sometimes they really are the best way, and that regardless of the type of analysis or tool you're going to use, this process of making sure you've got alignment is critical. And sometimes when you're using the more advanced tools, it's even more critical, because the cost of not doing it right up front is almost, it's exponential. So yes, you guys both touched upon this, and I know this is a big and very common theme we heard in the market research, which is about presenting your data out, right? And then we did get one comment, and I felt your pain, Sam. Whose responsibility is it to make the present portion palatable and understandable? I've often gone to data teams with what I thought was a simple question and get back multiple spreadsheets and boards that left me more confused than when I started.
Well, that's a failure of the, that's what people do when they don't know what they're doing. They say, it's like, I'm sorry, it reminds me of an academic example, because and that is when students write papers and they quote entire paragraphs, I say, like, oh, that means you don't know what that's saying. And providing people with an entire spreadsheet or with entire tables means you don't know how to summarize it. And so I do see that as a failure to either understand the question adequately or to know how to apply it to the business. And that's why, again, this process of alignment is, if the requester and the analyst are in sync on what this is supposed to accomplish, you're much less likely to get that. It's when I tell people, when they're, I say, most of the time you're working with a small organization, you're like a nonprofit, they just want a yes or a no. And you need to be able to finish with a yes or a no. You don't want to go to your doctor and have them give you your blood tests and have you scroll through 20 pages of that. You want to say, am I sick? Do I need to do something? I mean, there's so many analogies to that, but I would say that the analysts either didn't understand what the question was in the first place, which is why you have to have this define and refine step, or the data was so, ultimately confusing that they're kind of passing the buck, as opposed to being able to come back and say, we can't tell, or there is no clear recommendation. And there needs to be some room for that, because very often the data is just simply not sufficient to support a clear conclusion.
Yeah, there may be some of my old analysts on this call, but they would tell you that I used to tell them, before you schedule a meeting to show me a presentation, tell me what the results are in a tweet. If you can't put it in a tweet, then you don't know what the results are, right? And you're gonna be wasting my time. To Barton's point, right? If you can't say it concisely, then you didn't understand what the results were, right? So So yeah, it is absolutely incumbent upon the person who is responsible for the analysis to be able to explain, what the results of the analysis were. And I'll take it a step further. Tell me what's wrong with it. Everybody wants to say, oh, this is how marvelous my model was, and this is how great, and this is how predictive it is. Tell me what's wrong with it. Start with the blemishes, right? Shake it up, beat it up. Tell me where it's going to fail. That's what I want to know, right? How well do you know this? Because that's where, I'd rather we, break it up and find out what's wrong with it and where it's going to fall apart before it goes into production or into a client or into wherever, then, let's find it here and now. And the people who are actually doing that, those are the ones that I trust, right? Show me what the risks are. Show me what's wrong.
But I think, we're looking at data analysis, and if they're giving you just the spreadsheets, they're only delivering on half of that, right? They're just giving you back the data. And I think it's sometimes, to your point, Barton, it feels safe if I just give you the data and you make a decision off of it, but it really isn't doing a service to stakeholders or to the impact that they can have, right? To your career and what you can deliver. And I know we've talked to a few people who went through the course, and they were like, but like, they know, they just love the details. There's part of it's that like, they love the details. They liked it. They'll geek out and talk about the model forever. And knowing that, like, you can put some of that stuff in an appendix in case someone's curious, but like, let's make sure that you're leading with the points and the analysis itself. There is an interesting example of this, of someone who I think, in a good way, kind of proactively looked through some data, right? They looked at billing changes over the past 6 months, and they found, 30% of the bills went down, 30 stayed the same, and 40 went up. And they went to their CEO, being proactive, and were like, here's the data. And the CEO's reaction is, well, what do I do with the information? Right? So there's a lot of good things there about someone showing initiative. So their question is, if I don't start with a problem in the analysis, is there how do I make interesting data into business value?
Well, it's everybody's concerned about their business going bankrupt, or getting convicted of fraud. And so there are some universal concerns. I think about an organization I knew where they were just like, they just couldn't stay profitable. And they were just like cutting spending everywhere to try to stay in the black. And then it turned out that their office administrator had been embezzling money for several years. And that one person was responsible for the entire department struggling. And so, you want to know what's crazy? I actually know 2 offices where this exact same problem happened. And going and saying, like, we have something very strange going on here, and say, like, we're losing money. That's going to get anybody's attention. We're losing money in ways that don't make sense, and we think that there may be something fishy going on. I think anybody, well, unless the person you take it to is the person stealing the money, they're not going to be happy about that. But anybody else is going to be happy. Or say, we've lost an entire group of people. So what you're doing is you're coming up then with the general problem, and then you're going to try to decide, are we going to pursue this, or are we going to try to figure out what the problem is? Because again, the organization's goal is not to reduce spending within this particular department, but to make the company profitable and to not lose money overall. So it does require sometimes going to the big picture. And I think it's fair to bring up something that says this is affecting a big picture question, which is always operating in the background.
Mike, anything you would add?
No, I think Barton got that one well. Thank you, Barton.
Awesome. All right. Believe it or not, guys, we're almost out of time. And so first of all, I want to thank you, Mike and Bart, for a great session. I love hearing you guys talk about the model and the powerful way it sort of enables both analysts and to really impact corporate strategy and to have some real business outcomes. And I hope everyone else here did as well. I also know we did not get to all the questions, so we can stay back and answer some more questions if people want. But I did want to take a moment to talk about our new course, Business-Driven Data Analysis, which teaches a proven approach that you can leverage, as we just talked about, as you've seen, that you can leverage across data projects and tool sets to deliver timely data analysis with actionable insights. It really delves much deeper into each of those stages that we talked about, but it also creates a wonderful learning environment and all the sort of projects and real projects and data you need to actually build the muscle that we're talking about here, right? So it's not theoretical. You should do good presentations and have good questions. Like we do projects and we use real world data, and you start to really practice the skill sets in here in a way that you can immediately implement when you're back in the office. So we just launched this course last week. The first session starts November 15th. It is already filling up, so we would love to have you guys here. Also, another piece for everyone who registered today, we are sending out a complimentary copy of our ebook, Define, Laying the Foundations of Successful Data Analysis, which dives into the define stage a little bit further and talks about like a checklist of how you can really ensure that you're kind of defining a project that can be successful up front. And again, we did not get to all the questions, so if you want to stay, you are welcome to stay. But really, Mike and Barton, thank you so much for joining us today. Awesome. And thank you everyone for joining us. That does it for today's official Pragmatic Data Chat, although we'll be here. And again, thank you all for joining us. Have an outstanding rest of the week. All right, I believe Brian E. is staying. His question, which is a great question, if you don't mind, is the refine step. How much of the refine step is about setting maybe back to the stakeholders, getting them comfortable by telling them ahead of time the type of numbers or responses or issues they might expect?
Well, I think if you can go back to them and say, we just don't have the data, or, the question you're asking for works really well if we have 50,000 data points and we've got 500. That we're just not able to answer that question, or certainly not with a degree of precision that we would want. I think it's important to have that conversation as soon as possible. Same thing about going to them and saying, we can make a very good conclusion about this particular subgroup, but at the moment, we're not able to generalize it. And that gets back to what Mike talked about bias in models. Again, there's sometimes this assumption that things like, neural networks are these mystical, magical machines that can do anything. But if all of your data comes from, upper middle class white Americans, it's not going to generalize to anybody else, regardless of how sophisticated your model is.
Yeah, I think the bad news early is also just a good a good rule of thumb. All right.
Rebecca, I saw a question here. Somebody asked about the lagging versus the leading indicators, and I just wanted to clarify that. So, yeah, and this is something that came up at a project I've been working on recently, where a lot of data that comes out of a lot of businesses is coming through accounting, right? So you got a lot of, and sometimes accounting is using things like accruals and that kind of information. And accruals is just an accounting mechanism to say, hey, we recognize this sale during this time. It's not actually like an event didn't actually happen then, right? It's just, because time passed, they're, recognizing sales during certain periods and that kind of thing. And really all of accounting, right, that a lot of these, ROI and all of these, and sales and so on and so forth, it's a historical measure that's going back in time. But when you really want to start moving the needle on businesses, it's usually being driven by the leading indicators within the business, right? If you're a manufacturing business, then you're doing it by, understanding, the throughput on some of the machines, right? Or the inventory that's coming in the back door. If you're a retailer, then you're monitoring how many customers are coming in, right? Or how many advertisements are going out, right? Those are the kinds of leading indicators that are coming in well in advance of the financial reports being made, right? And that's what a lot of the requests that you get from the business are around the financial reports, but the models that need to be built are around how do I build something out of the leading indicators. And a lot of the people in the organization who are responsible for the P&L might not even understand that, that connection, right? So in some ways, the business analyst or the data analyst is going to need to understand some of those metrics even more than some of the business stakeholders.
Yeah, that's probably true about a variety of metrics, right? That's I think sometimes where the tripping gets up in the definition stages is there is knowledge of certain metrics, and then there's like understanding of metrics, and not everybody brings the same depth to each one.
Right, and somebody else asked, where does the product manager come in? It depends on what organization you are, right? If this is, if all of this is related to building a product to support this, then the product manager needs to be front and center and present and probably helping to drive this whole discussion of the business problem, right, that we're trying to solve. So, you need the right stakeholders because it's an organizational process, not just a departmental process.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because we're Pragmatic. We had quite a few product managers on here, and I think the model really resonates from them, right? It's a way they're used to thinking about approaching projects with engineering teams, right? When they're thinking about like, okay, we need to have really clear requirements. We need to understand what problem we're solving, who we're solving it for, and then we work together with development and design teams to kind of iterate on solutions for that. And I think the idea that you would apply, and you really need to apply that same approach when you're partnering with your data teams. So it's not necessarily, I think the model was like, yes, I get that. And I should do that over here as well. And the answer is yes, you should. All right. I think those were all the unanswered questions. We can find out some fun ways to do that. But I really do appreciate you, Barton and Mike. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks for having me.